more a little bit about this class. So I encourage you to look for that class. Okay, so here's just some framing for the conversation this evening. Some of the world's most disruptive and successful businesses are growing because they've emerged as emulating social movements. And these are ventures that have succeeded explicitly because they are leveraging the power of shared values that are usually, and in ways that are usually more common among just straight social movements. Things like disrupting the status quo and democratizing power and gain. And companies like Airbnb, and Douglas is an executive at Airbnb, have used these principles to successfully disrupt industries that a lot of people thought were just fundamentally static. And this is a very new way to do business, and it appears in a lot of ways to grow the overall economic pie. And part of what's fascinating to me about the role of social movements in business is that in traditional social movements, there's a long history that has created what is essentially a set of critical paths for how a social movement navigates forward. And businesses like Airbnb are really charting this as they go. So this is really uncharted territory for us. And we have precisely the right people to explore this tonight, and I'm going to introduce them. We're going to watch a very short video, and then we're going to dive into the conversation. So let me start by introducing Paula first. Paula Goldman is an entrepreneur, an anthropologist, and a movement strategist. She leads a team at Omidyar Network that seeks to advance the impact investing industry through a combination of investments, strategic partnerships, and thought leadership. She also acts as an advisor on advocacy efforts across Omidyar Network's investment initiatives. And she is also one of Haas's inaugural Social Impact Fellows. She was born in Singapore, has lived in 8 countries across 4 continents, and I feel like at least half the time when I try to reach out to you, you are in a different country, at least. I'm very envious of that. She earned her PhD from Harvard. She got a master's from Princeton. And most importantly, though, she got her bachelor's here at Cal, just so you know. She has taught here at Berkeley and at Mills, and she is a frequent contributor to FT and HBR and Huffington Post. Our other very distinguished guest is Douglas Atkin. Douglas is the global head of community at Airbnb, and like Paula, he is one of the world's greatest thinkers on social movements. I'm just really setting you guys up here. Yes. The pressure. And don't forget, we're live on the interwebs. He is the co-founder and chairman of Peers, a global movement for the sharing economy. He is the founder of the Glue Project, a blog and venture to create social glue through community. He is the co-founder of Purpose, an organization that mobilizes millions for social change. He is a board member of allout.org, the world's largest LGBT movement, and also the author of The Culting of Brands, How to Turn Customers into True Believers, a book about how to build cult-like community around almost anything, and clearly a very busy man. So we're very lucky to have Paula and Douglas, and I'd like to ask you to just give them a warm welcome to Haas. So if we could actually begin with the video, that would be great. very different framing for a business. I mean, businesses frequently are trying to evoke strong emotional responses to their brands, but often, have a very sort of very thin link to the actual brand, and instead just rely on other frames. Just maybe you can start the conversation by just answering the question of the evening about what businesses can learn from social movements, and to some degree maybe relate it to some of the elements that are in that video.
Sure, yeah. Actually, that was just a little video we produced last July when we launched our, as I call it, our equal opportunity genitalia logo. There's something in there for everyone. So especially when you draw it. And it's so we launched the logo. We launched the logo, but more importantly, the idea was to launch the idea, which is anyone can belong anywhere. The idea of belong anywhere, which is something that was something I worked on actually starting 2 years ago when I first joined Airbnb. I was really trying to understand what it was that Airbnb did, basically what its kind of role was, and talked to lots and lots of guests and hosts and other people. And it was essentially boiled down to that, was that it enabled you, because you were staying with locals in local neighborhoods where there aren't generally any hotels and it's a totally different experience anyway, you really feel like you're sort of the world's local. You feel like you're sort of half at home and half in somewhere strange and new, and it felt like there was a possibility of belonging anywhere. Anyway, that's a whole other story that I'm actually working on right now. In terms of your question though, wow, gosh, where to start? So I've been through a sort of odd journey, I guess, over the past 10 years through different kinds of formats of communities. First of all, I was really interested in what makes people belong and believe at a very fundamental level. And I ended up interviewing hundreds and hundreds of members of cults and cult-like organizations, everything from Krishna to members of religions, sports teams, Trekkies, sororities, and so on. And the whole idea was to sort of, the hypothesis was that the reason why people belonged to those very strong, extreme belonging organizations was basically the same. It was just a matter of degree, and if we could somehow deconstruct that would be interesting to understand why people become committed. And that eventually led to that book, The Culting of Brands. And then so from then I went to meetup.com. Some of you may be familiar with that, where I was a partner and chief community officer. And that was really interesting. So going from talking to really extreme forms of belonging to being like dunked in like a tea bag into sort of everyday, ordinary communities formed about pugs and learning Spanish and guitar playing and stuff, that, parenting, really mainstream stuff, tens and tens of thousands of them. And then from there, I met this guy, Jeremy Hyman's, and we started Purpose, which is two things: a consultancy which advises mostly non-profits on how to use movement techniques, movement-making techniques for social change. And we also, secondly, incubate our own movements, and that's where All Out came from, which is now the world's largest gay rights movement. And then from there, I went to Airbnb and trying to deploy all of those learnings, but adding a new one, which was a grassroots organizing, which Airbnb, amongst other peer-to-peer companies, is basically we're operating in a new economy that's bumping up against old economy laws. And this whole adventure where we really started using movement-making techniques at Airbnb anyway, started when the Attorney General of New York, last August, September, issued a subpoena. And we decided to not obey it and to take him to court because we thought it was a massive data overreach. He wanted all the information of all of our hosts, 15,000 hosts in New York, for no good reason in our view. And fortunately we won that. But we only did it. We did it, there was a very sticky moment actually at one point in one of the kind of long sweaty meetings whether we were deciding whether to do this or not, because as far as I know, I think we're the only company that ever has said no to a subpoena to the Attorney General of New York, or at least certainly in the past 10 or 20 years. And that was Brian, who's the CEO, co-founder, said that we can only do this if our community joins us in the fight. And he sort of looked at me and said, do you think you can get them to do that? And I said, yes. And that's when we basically scrambled like crazy to mobilize our community to basically change the law in New York to make it a fairer, more equitable law for all New Yorkers, including hosts on Airbnb. And ironically, in New York, we have not won that battle at all, but we have started winning it in other cities where we've deployed similar techniques. So to answer your question, well, there's so many things to learn, and Paula probably would know better, but there's several things I've learned. One is there's this thing called the commitment curve, which maybe I can talk about later. I will show you an example of. The commitment curve is we used it on purpose, and it's a way of mobilizing the maximum number of people to take the same action together on a single leverageable point that affects change. So the way I would describe sort of a modern mass movement, which is a combination of online and offline tools, is it's mobilizing often millions of people to take the same action at the same time against the same leverageable point. And the leverageable point could be, like in All Out's case, it was the Ugandan parliament when they were about to debate the Kill the Gays bill. So we scrambled over 4 days to get, in the end, 500,000 signatures and loads of political support to stop that debate. So the leverageable point there was the Ugandan parliament. It could be a politician. It could be, in India, they were running a homophobic TV shows. So with that leverageable point, there was the TV station's CEO. So that's what a movement is. Grassroots organizing is scaling intimacy in a very local way to also mobilize large numbers of people to do the same things. And you use the commitment curve, which sort of goes like this. It's kind of like the commitment on asks on this side and time on that side. And you go like this. So basically, you make low barrier asks to begin with, like signing a petition, which is easy. And then you make increasingly harder asks that require more commitment, but also make often bigger change and yield greater reward. And that's a really, really common sense, basic tool that I learnt, first of all at Meetup actually, but then we applied it on a purpose in movement making, and we're applying it now in programming sort of what we're asking our community to do in terms of taking political action.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There is a lot there that we will go into over the course of the evening.
So I really skimmed the surface there.
Yeah. No, thank you. Paulo, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, on that first question.
Sure, and similar to Douglas, it's hard for me to answer the question without talking about how my journey got me to think about the question. So it's worth just briefly going over that. So I, after graduating from Cal many years ago, spent a bunch of time in emerging markets, working with a bunch of startups, and helped start an organization called the International Museum of Women, which was an online advocacy-based organization that used creative media to try to raise awareness about issues affecting women around the world. And so all of that was very kind of social cause-y driven. And I, for better or for worse, decided it would be a great idea to go back and get a PhD and study how unorthodox ideas become mainstream. And I looked at the trajectory of, dozens and dozens of major social movements. And I found that although the time periods were way longer, the general curve of events and stuff seemed to be very similar to the adoption curve for new technology and innovation, and these kind of leaps from early adopters to early majority that required, reframing the idea and changing the idea. So it was like, wow, there's this really interesting parallel between social movements and commercial innovation. And then after I finished my PhD, I landed at Omidyar Network. And for those of you that are not familiar with Omidyar Network, it's the philanthropic investment firm that was started by eBay's Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay. And we do both for-profit and nonprofit investing, all in businesses that serve to empower individuals to make the most of their lives, in short. A lot in emerging markets, and I have two jobs there. One of which is to grow the impact investing market. The other of which is I work with our teams and our portfolio companies to think about social movement strategy and how to integrate that into their day-to-day work. And what I started to notice was that there were a ton of businesses in our portfolio that operate like social movements. Meetup is one of them. Change.org, which, that one is pretty clear. Nation Builder, which helps individuals and organizations run campaigns. Couchsurfing. I mean, I could go on. And those are kind of obvious ones. There's also some less obvious ones that I'm happy to talk about. So I started thinking a lot about, okay, what can businesses, what's the reverse of what I looked at in my dissertation, what can businesses learn from social movements? And there's a ton. So let me just start with the headline, which is kind of a big picture thought, and then I can talk about a bunch of strategies and tactics. But the headline is that, technology has completely transformed the relationship between businesses and consumers, right? So we no longer live in a world where businesses are determining where people see their product, how people see their product, who introduces them to their product, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of businesses have not caught up, right? There's this very flat conversation about how to manage social media, get a social media manager, get a community manager. And the smartest businesses, the smartest consumer-facing businesses are looking at that and saying, in many cases, consumers are starting to determine the products, be the products of these businesses. And if you're going to enable that to happen and thrive in that world, you have to figure out how you grow authentic, passionate communities that are themselves authentically mobilized to, and driving towards the same cause essentially as your business. So that's the high level, and there's tons of strategies that we can talk about, but that's where I would start.
Well, actually, building off that, I think one of the reasons we showed that film is that in my view, I don't know if you agree, but one of the most important things you need for any movement, any social movement, could be civil rights movement, gay marriage movement, whatever, is you need a seemingly impossible goal that or vision which imagines the world as it should be rather than the way it is now. And so in All Out, for example, just to give you an example, and there's normally a sort of I call it the fuck off crazy goal, and then there's the ridiculous metric that goes with it. And so in All Out, our goal is equality everywhere, and the metric is 7610 to 00. So in 76 countries in the world, it's illegal to be gay, and 10 you can be executed or life in prison to be gay. So All Out's goal is equality everywhere, or basically 00, which seems ridiculously impossible. And that's exactly what you should have if you're a movement. You should really go for how the world should be rather than the way it is now, because that is a massive, massive motivator and passion generator amongst people. In our case, in a very modest way as a company, what we wanted to see is a world where all 7 billion people can feel like they can belong anywhere.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about this in the traditional language of social movement, where there really is a vision of how the world is different that people aspire to. And the question I have related to that is, when it comes to using social movement principles in business, to what degree do you have to pay attention to what's in it for me as a principle? Do people, how far does authentic passion go? And do you think, in the case of Airbnb and the way you've organized, and I'd love for you to also maybe talk about the science of this, because Douglas has a deck of slides that we're going to share with all the participants that is remarkable in how it breaks down the science of how they created community. And he corrected me earlier to say that it is part science but also part art. Yeah. But can you say a little bit about, both of you, about that issue of whether someone needs to get something? And the last thing I'll say is, I think of a very imperfect analogy, but in crowdsourcing, for social impact, there's really been limited success with crowdsourcing campaigns where someone didn't get a product that was a prototype. The organizations really struggle when they can't deliver something beyond good karma or feeling they contributed to a cause.
I guess I have a couple of thoughts. I'm not totally sure how they relate to each other, but one is that it's part of the beauty of running a business that you've got a product. People are either going to buy it or they're not, right? So in some sense, the what's in it for them is fairly clear, if that's the part of the answer that you're looking at. But I will say, to the extent that, you look around, just go on Twitter and you see tons of companies putting up campaigns that are so blatantly see-through, right? Asking people to share their feedback on a super meaningless question, or crowdsourcing holiday photos, right? As a community member, as a consumer, whether this is the authentic DNA of a company. and whether they really care about their community or not, right? And so you see time after time, sometimes this is just a huge waste of money for companies if they don't really mean it. And sometimes it just, is actually really embarrassing from them. People start calling them out and there's huge backlash, right?
Yeah,
So,
it just, the issue of control, you're talking about as just business models where the control is flipped, and so inauthenticity becomes dangerous.
I think from what I've seen, there was a time when I was at Meetup, I was trying to kind of deconstruct what made a successful movement. Obviously, you did a much better job than I did with your PhD, but I was just like in an amateur way trying to figure out what the key ingredients of movements were throughout history. And there were like 16 things I think I saw, but one of them was in terms of understanding what the motivations were for people to participate and engage. It was the ideal state was there was both an altruistic reason and a selfish reason. So, for example, let's take marriage equality. For a lot of people, in All Out anyway, what we find is I think at least half of our members, which is over 2 million now, are straight. And basically, a lot of people participate because it's the right thing to do, equality everywhere, but they'll also participate because they have a brother or a friend or an uncle who's gay, or they're gay, and there is a sort of selfish or pseudo-selfish motivation, which is that person I love and respect needs to be treated fairly as well. And so it's hard to tease them apart, it really is, but I think the ideal mixture is a mixture of altruism and selfishness in a way. In terms of, there's a slightly different question, I think, about authenticity. What I was just talking about is the individual members of the social movement's motivation to participate. And by the way, the other way that I would really, really define as a movement versus an ordinary community or a cult or whatever is that it's people taking action. So as I said, it's normally huge numbers of people taking action together. They can't just be having conversations, they have to take an action, whether it's sign a petition, go on a demonstration, go and talk to their lawmaker, whatever it is, they have to make an action. And that's why it is really, really helpful to kind of dig into the motivations of how and why people do that. It's one of the reasons we developed this commitment curve is to map the kinds of actions up there. If people are interested, I can whiz you.
Why don't you show?
Are you interested in that, to see the commitment curve?
Okay.
What I've done here is use our what we did in New York actually a year and a bit ago as an example. I'm going to have to flick through loads of slides to get there. Sorry. I don't know if you can get there quicker. It's going to be at the end of this presentation. That's my definition of movement. Oh God, I've got to talk about this. This is my favorite quote by anyone anywhere at any time. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. By coincidence, the Midian network has that in their reception. All Out campaigns, Grassroots. That's a shot from Barcelona, and this is San Francisco, where we organized our community a couple of months ago. So I'm going to whiz through these quickly just to get the bit I'm trying to talk about this. I had no idea what we were going to talk about. There we go. There's lots of stuff in here. If you're interested, these are some of the ingredients I think you need to create a community that scales and take action. And one of them is the commitment curve. Here we come with that. Sorry about this, everyone. Here we are. Okay, commitment curve. This helps you model what asks you should make and when. That's the other way to think about it is if you're organizing a movement for whatever, you should think about asks. You're asking people to take action. You have to think about what you're asking them to do, what it's going to take for them to do it, and what effect it's going to have for the big goal that you have. So here's the basic principle of the commitment curve is this. It's a commitment on the left side and time on the bottom there. And the whole point of this is that you should start with low barrier to entry asks and then gradually ramp people up the commitment curve. So just to give you an example of that, this is actually what we did in Doc. Technical problems. Great. So the first thing we did a year and a bit ago in New York was and this was with Peers. Peers was launched originally about a year and a half ago as a movement for the sharing economy in general. We asked people to sign a petition to legalize sharing in New York. And we originally set a goal of 20,000. In the end, we got 234,000 actually. Petitions are really good to start a campaign with because they're really easy for people to do. It's a very small ask. It's normally a click and putting in information in your email and whatnot. And it's a really low barrier to entry. But what it also is, by the way, is people are putting their hands up and saying, I want to be involved and take action. So people are self-identifying as engaged members. Then the next thing we did was ask them to tell their story, which is harder, much harder, because you have to spend a good probably 20 minutes thinking about it and writing your story. And we created a Tumblr page with Peers, which asked hosts and guests to tell their stories about why Airbnb and hosting in New York should be legalized. Hosts wrote about how it helped them actually live in their apartment, stay in the apartment and afford their rent because they could get people to do this after they were made redundant. And guests talked about, really enjoying the local neighborhoods and local culture. Then the next thing we asked was, and actually we sent this email to the people who signed the petition in New York. Said, do you want to come to an action meetup? And we're going to, if you're coming to this meetup, it's basically you're putting your hand up and saying you want to be involved to a much greater degree. And we held this at a co-working space, really cold November night. We thought 50 people would come and 250 came, plus the media, Al Jazeera and NPR and all that lot. So that was a bit of a laugh. And what we did in that meeting actually was separate people up into 13 action teams, neighborhood action teams. Then the next thing we asked was tweet your senator. Normally this would be further down here in a campaign because it's a fairly low barrier ask. The only thing was that a lot of people in New York, especially hosts, felt there was a witch hunt being undertaken by the Attorney General. And so they really did not want to identify themselves in any way. So it was actually a higher ask than you would normally have anywhere else. Then we crowdfunded an ad in the Albany Times, I think it was. In Albany is where is the capital of New York, where the decision makers are. And we raised, I think, almost $10,000 to run this ad, which is pretty cool. This is just one example, but then we did ask some key people to identify themselves and say, basically to out themselves as a host in this very, very, kind of negative environment that the Attorney General created. And then we organized a senator visit. In the first snowstorm in New York in 2013, we got 36 people out to visit a state senator and tell their story and make their case. Then we were going to do a rally in December in New York. It was insane, really. And we really, we had got the food organized. We booked the bands, Dirty Projectors. They're awesome, apparently. And but then the city did a very slow walk with a permit for the park, of course, and we weren't allowed to do it, and we weren't quite prepared to break the law instead. So, but that would have been like the biggest one of all. Especially this one here, attending an action meetup, senator visit, and attending a rally. These are all, you're asking people to leave their warm home on a cold night and do something fairly dramatic. That's normally fairly well up the commitment curve. Things you can do online tend to be lower down here. They're just easier. So is that helpful? It gives you an idea of what the commitment curve and the kinds of asks that would go up.
So I have a question for Paula related to this. So I'm gonna come back in a second to you, Douglas, and ask a bit about just what it was like within Airbnb to learn how to do this. But Paula, can you just more generally speak to how companies build the culture that is required to do this sort of thing successfully, even if it's not to the same degree to which Airbnb did it in New York in Douglas's example?
Yeah, so if I may, can I just build on one of the things first that Douglas was saying? And I think it relates to your question about what needs to be in it for the community or the customer. There is a really strong aspect of this that's about identity. And that's classic to movements.
Absolutely agreed.
It's also generally about a sort of counterculture identity or something. So you want the world to be radically different, And thus you want to associate with people that share that value. And when you see yourself participating in that community, it gives you this ego satisfaction, whatever. I mean, maybe it's not ego, but it is your identity, right? And I think tapping into that, if you can tap into that authentically, you're creating communities. And sometimes it's about really big things, like it's about the organics industry or whatever, or sometimes it says it's about barefoot running or do it yourself. You know, it goes from, it spans the spectrum. But I think that is one of the motivations that both successful movements and community-driven brands tap into really, really well. I mean, another example of that, I'm obsessed with ModCloth. How many of you out there know ModCloth? So it's an e-commerce brand that does.
It's very countercultural. Only three people raise their hands.
Right. Super countercultural. No, it's women's fashion, right? But there is a little bit of a countercultural piece of it, right? Which is that they're super community driven. It's all kind of vintagey fashion, but they've taken a no Photoshop pledge. So when you go on a traditional fashion site, you see these very perfectly manicured women. You go on this site, you see people that look like you see people of all shapes and sizes, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, oh yeah, this is kind of a community. This is a cool community. I really want to belong to it. I believe in these values, and I like go back to that site all the time. It's kind of crazy and not very good for my checkbook. Anyway, so that was in answer to your first question. The second question was about how to create this culture.
Yeah,
that's probably actually something that Douglas can speak to a little bit more directly. But what I can say is that two things. One, it's got to be baked into the product itself, right? So one sort of non-traditional example of a portfolio organization that I see as a movement. We have a company called Lendo that works in the Philippines and Colombia, and its mission is to empower low and middle income folks to be able to get access to credit to be able to improve their lives. So. To go to school or start a business or whatnot. And, and the banks are really not that great at serving this customer base because they don't have formal credit cards and access to a credit history and whatnot. And so they've got this really interesting algorithm that accesses people's social networks. So it, looks at how deep your ties are on Facebook and LinkedIn and WhatsApp and whatnot to come up with a credit score and do these tiny little loans. And what's really interesting is that this is a company that, basically the product itself is inherently social. It's inherently a product that's saying like, hey, you sign up to try to get a loan, you need a few folks in your area, in your network to vouch for you. And if your community rallies around you, you're gonna be able to get this loan and improve your life, right? And so the whole company is organized authentically around this mission. And so it's totally consistent in every aspect of the business. And I think that's the deal. If it's just a tack on, if it's just a tactic, forget it.
Okay, thank you. And Douglas, do you want to say a little bit more about the culture question and maybe just a few words on the learning journey on how you guys got to this?
So when I was a Purpose, actually, this was this consultancy that advised mostly nonprofits and NGOs on how to mobilize large numbers of people for social change. We also did talk to a few companies, and we very quickly realized that most companies shouldn't do it because they can't do it authentically. They don't have the real commitment that it takes to do something long term like this. They're not willing to take the risks that are huge that are out there to ask members of their community to do things which may seem very unorthodox. So this was like 6-7 years ago, so maybe it's changed a bit now. So that we said no to most companies most of the time. For those, we had this sort of bullshit meter and we really interrogated them about their motives and their commitments and everything, saying, look, we're easy. Just wait until the press gets hold of you and interrogates you about your motives and your real commitment and your real processes and whether you're really doing this, because you'll be eviscerated. So it's better that we say no now than you attempt this and then completely screw it up. In terms of Airbnb, it's really hard to talk. I'm just realizing this. It's sort of hard to talk about the culture when you're in it in a way, I suppose. But it starts at the top. So Brian, who's the CEO, co-founder, all the three founders, but Brian in particular is totally up for doing the unconventional and taking a risk. And if it's the right thing to do. And so there is that. And I've never actually come across a company culture like that before, to that degree, where we're willing to, but we also want to do the right thing. So,
can you say, actually, it makes me think of the question of investors' tolerance for this sort of risk. I mean, you look at it objectively and you see giving your customers complete control, breaking rules, potentially breaking laws that may not exist yet, right? Can you each say a little bit about the degree to which you feel like, and clearly huge upside too, right? Like, what have your experiences been like with investors?
Well, you are the investor.
We are an investor.
So what do you take that one
or when
first?
you talk to other, like some of your peer investors, right? I mean, Omidyar is clearly not your standard investor.
So I'm trying to think of specifics here. Yeah, so Omidyar is a very different type of investor. We take the long view. We're an evergreen fund. Our bottom line is social impact, and we invest in businesses where we expect to get great returns, but the primary motivation is about improving people's lives. I will say there is a shift in investor mindset around this. Not necessarily, so the whole bit about social movements and cause-driven businesses is part of it. I'm thinking about the launch of things like Obvious Ventures and Ev Williams being involved in that, and this kind of move in Silicon Valley around impact investing, where we're seeing folks like in the latest change.org round, it was folks like, it was an A-list round. It was Reid Hoffman, Bill Gates, folks that have, now these are not traditional investors in the sense that these are investing as individuals in this company, but these are folks that are have made tremendous fortunes driving businesses and are looking at these businesses that are driving massive movements and saying, this is a big bet, I want to get behind them. So I think there's a shift. There's the beginning of a shift.
And Douglas, that makes me think of another question for you. To what degree is Airbnb about altruism, right? Like some people would look at this prompt, you think of social movements as creating public good. What role does altruism play in your business model? Or is it just a really wonderful side effect?
So first of all, we're definitely a business, okay? And but I would maybe we have some of those kinds of investors because they definitely want to see a return on their money, but they're always encouraging us to take risks. Sometimes greater risks than we're willing to take, which is pretty unusual for a board. I would say a huge motivating reason people get up and go to work at Airbnb is because of this mission of belong anywhere. I'm not trying to say that this is a company dressed up as a social movement. It's not at all. It's a company. But what's, I guess, different about it is that we're a platform, which is like different from many companies who make things, I suppose, like the old production consumption economy, call it, where people produce goods like BMW makes cars and people consume goods like cars. Whereas we don't actually produce anything. We produce a marketplace on which hosts and guests meet their needs. Hosts often make an income, but also enjoy the other sides of it, and guests get to stay in a great place and discover the local environment. So it's hard to tease those things apart, to be honest. I don't know if I could. But I would say, yes, I would just call it altruism. I would say we're in it to also make the world a better place than it is now.
Okay. Thank you. So I think I'd like to ask folks in the audience if they have any questions. 3 of us have been talking for a while. We've got a microphone here. If anyone has a question, feel free to come on up. Okay.
Thanks for coming tonight. I'd like to get your opinion on what you think happened or could have been done better with the Occupy movement? What happened with that?
That's a really good question. Wow. Wow, that's a hell of a question. That's brilliant. You go first.
I can tackle this, and I will put a huge disclaimer on my response, which is that because this is not something that I followed in great detail, but I will say I think answering this question requires really understanding how movements operate as a whole, and generally we sort of conflate campaigns and movements, right? So. And campaigns can last over a couple of periods of years, and movements have lasted centuries, right? And I think, Occupy, you can consider it a failure insofar as we don't read about it in the headlines. You can consider it a success insofar as, the 99%, the idea of inequality of wealth is a mainstream topic of conversation. It's in the newspapers. It's being discussed at Davos. It's really gotten a lot of traction. So if you take the long view of a movement, you say, wow, here's this long-term adoption curve. Occupy was in many ways very successful in its mission of getting this on the mainstream agenda. There is now a vacuum about kind of what happens next and how that movement continues to push that agenda and create structural change around it.
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and I'd like to know the answer myself. So my kind of qualifier to this is I don't know enough about the Occupy movement, about what they did right or what they did wrong, to be honest, to be really qualified to answer it. The only thing I would perhaps add is that the way I would assess a movement, and yes, it can take longer than just a year or two, is the impact it has and the change it makes. And I guess nowadays there are tools available for you to make big impacts very quickly, largely, as I said before, by mobilizing large numbers of people to make change. So I'm just going to talk again about the movement that I'm most familiar with, which is All Out. We've run about, 30 campaigns around the world. Often these campaigns only last like a few months, sometimes a year, but they've made a real difference. And by making, on the commitment curve, by making asks in a very, sort of a mixture of art and science way that get large numbers of people to take actions that make a difference. And so we led the marriage equality initiative in France, which was successful. We were the ones who associated the homophobia issue in Russia with the Sochi Olympics. And the You Can't Kill the Gays bill, we stopped twice, although it's up for a third. So we can point to specific things that happened, that either didn't happen or did happen because of the actions of thousands or tens of thousands or millions of people that acted together to make a change. And I didn't see Occupy do that. I didn't see Occupy go beyond the communities that were in the various squares around the world. Beyond that, I didn't see them asking any of us to do something to make a real change, a real big change.
Can I play devil's advocate for a
Please.
moment?
Yeah, I'd love to debate this.
So something like All Out, built on decades and decades of history of LGBT organizing and gay rights organizing, and a series of wins, like getting homosexuality out of the definition of mental illness, like these things that have happened decade after decade after decade. I'm not familiar enough with the history and the antecedents of Occupy, but sometimes it's important to judge movements by sort of where they start in that adoption curve. So
No, you're probably right.
I'm not sure. I don't know how to answer the question.
But I think they missed a massive opportunity, let me put it that way, because they did have the headlines.
Yeah,
they really did.
That I would agree with.
And and I was I think I was at Purpose at that time, and we were kind of going, and make the ask. It was like, get people to do it. You've got everyone's attention, and that kind of like fizzled away after time.
Yeah.
But what's been great is that they've definitely created a meme in the cultures around the world of the 99%, and raised the taboo subject of a class war in places like America, which I think is really great. But they should have asked people to take action, in my view.
Part of what I'm hearing from both of you is the issue of leadership, right? And maybe the potential vacuum of leadership in the Occupy movement. Douglas, can you talk a little bit about the role of shared leadership within the model of community at Airbnb? Because when we were
For
chatting
sure.
earlier.
Yeah.
And feel free, I know that there's some slides that might delve into it as well. If you
I
wanna go into
I
that.
don't want to kind of. So we ran a campaign starting this time last year, actually, in San Francisco, to same as New York really, is to create a much fairer set of laws that recognizes this new economy. In our case, it's sharing your home or apartment or whatever else. And the way there were kind of like many leaders, but the real leader was a guy called Peter Kwan, who's a host in North Beach, I think it is. And he's an ex-law professor, knows a lot about the law, happened to be very passionate about it. And we have a platform on our site called Groups for hosts. And they self-organize and run their own communities. We don't get involved at all. And he'd already created one in San Francisco that was specifically about legislation, taxation, and all those things. And so I went to him and said, Peter, do you agree that the law needs to be fairer? Yes. Would you like to work in partnership to see if we can make that happen? Yes. So Peter's a pretty unusual individual. Basically, though, he led this group. It started off with about 300, I think, ended up with being 1,500 really, really committed people. And so he basically created with us this Fair to Share campaign and movement in San Francisco. And my part of the bargain was I will provide the resources to help you do what you need to do to help change the law. You know, we have lobbyists as well. We have the public policy people in our department, and they did an amazing job, continue to do an amazing job at City Hall. But we realized that our community needed to... Actually, where all this started was, I'm thinking of it, 2 years ago when I was doing some focus groups with hosts in San Francisco. After the focus groups, several hosts came up and said, Airbnb is getting big now. Can't you get the law changed in San Francisco? Don't you have lobbyists and so on? And I said, yes, there's lobbyists, but why don't you, thinking of my background, why don't you all get together and organize yourselves as a group of citizens and go to City Hall and tell your story and tell them you want a fairer law? And they said, we would love to do that, but we don't know how. And then I said, you're right. I know, that's true. It is actually harder than it seems to organize yourselves and make a difference as a bunch of citizens and change the law. So that's when I went to Peter and said, I know it's harder than most people think it is, but it is possible. And so I hired the grassroots organizing teams that the Obama campaign in 2008 and 2012 really wrote the playbook on grassroots organizing. And so I hired those people basically from those campaigns to advise Peter and us on how to mobilize large numbers of people in San Francisco to tell their stories and make their opinions known. And so that's what we did. And we used the commitment curve, and it ended up being very successful. The law was changed in November, and I was astounded. We had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hosts, small businesses that benefited from guests staying in neighborhoods that tourists would never normally go to, showing up, giving up a day of work to sit 8 or 9 hours in City Hall hearing room and testifying, often till, there was one time at 10 at night, but there's still like 100 people waiting to testify, and they had to turn the lights off because it was time to finish.
Wow.
And that was at the top of the commitment curve.
Yeah.
That ask was right up there. But in the end, talking about the science of this, we made 33,000 phone calls to people, 6,000 people we spoke to. We met them all face-to-face or in groups. And about 95% of them agreed to participate in this political action, which is off the charts, by the way.
95%.
Yeah, the Obama people in the grassroots organizing, they said if they got a 30% participation rate, they were really pleased. They had never seen anything like that.
And do you think the what's in it for me element had something
Yeah,
to do with
a
that?
lot of it. Well, two things. One is, one of the reasons I love San Francisco and this Bay Area is there's a lot, it's very progressive, and it's very, people, if I may generalize, being an outsider, people want to do the right thing, get the right thing for everyone. And so there was a huge amount of altruism motivation. But at the end of the day, for many of these hosts, this was their livelihood as well. So that was definitely.
There's just an aside, because I know I want to hear from the audience. But there was a study done that a friend of mine did. He looked at like kind of the most successful outsized social movements in the United States, and actually, and if you think about them across the political spectrum, you know, the National Rifle Association. Think about some of these organizations. The American Automobile Association, which most people don't know, lobby kind of against public transportation and for automobile rights and stuff like that. You can go on and on. The AARP. What these groups have in common is that they don't just appeal to people to do the right thing. They give them products and services that are meaningful and useful in their lives, that they're often willing to pay for. And on the back of that have built enormous scale. And on the back of that have enormous political clout. Right?
This is in Stanford Social Innovation Review, right? It's a great piece. I encourage people in the audience to read that. Yeah, that's a great. I'm glad you raised that.
Yeah.
So I have another question for you, Paula. But are there other questions in the audience? Anyone else have a question?
So there's a great article in NPR from Catherine Bracey from Code for America that's saying, you know, your product and service is only as good as the community organizing behind it. And you talked about having a marketplace, and it's a two-sided thing. There's a win-win that has to happen. That's not your control. They have to do that for themselves. In consumer products, we'll talk about things like virality or the network effect, right? Where the people that power this product or service are equally as important as the product itself. I'm curious, the flip side, if you have seen insights from business being brought back into social media, and were there advances or innovations that came from the business world that you have seen kind of successfully adapted and adopted?
What a great question. You can answer this, can't you?
Yeah.
You wrote a thesis about it.
Yeah. I would say two things. So one is what I just said, which is the revenue model. Like actually looking at, you know, treating your movement as a business and understanding your revenue model makes a huge amount of difference, as we were just talking about. So that's one. And that's a little hard because a lot of social movement organizers see themselves as kind of rallying against the man and against, you know, so the idea of seeing it as a business is sometimes counterintuitive. So that's one. The second is, like, you know, a lot of social movements have incorporated the very best principles of branding into their work, and not without controversy. So again, think about some of the social movements that have the biggest brand recognition in the world. Breast cancer, right? Breast cancer, the pink ribbon is like, I don't care what country you go to, almost every country, people recognize that. And that was because, like, you know, it was like a pretty extensive branding exercise where breast cancer was once heavily counterculture, you know, was seen as a radical feminist cause. People couldn't talk about it in public. It was not seen as a polite topic of conversation. And it got transformed into this thing that folks across the political spectrum, big corporations, could embrace, and thus achieved that kind of level of ubiquity. And not without criticism, right? Because there are folks that started out in that kind of that counterculture phase that have said that cause is watered down now, right? So, but I would say if you look at successful social movements, that element of branding is taken straight from business playbook.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at Purpose, this consultancy, the branding element of it, branding those movements, huge part of it all. Completely. Yeah. I think you answered it, basically.
Anyone else have a question before I dive back in? Yes?
Oh.
Someone in the back.
So there seems to be an implicit assumption. You guys have touched on it, so I think we've seen much of the opposite throughout history, and I was struggling to think of business examples, and wondering if the downside to all of this, imagine it latching on to these ideals or these principles and perhaps taking it less. So I've seen examples of that, or I think it's something.
Well, to go back, the thing I mentioned before may be relevant here, which is I think too many businesses borrow the techniques of movement making for really inauthentic, insubstantial campaigns and reasons. And And they're really just sort of dressed up marketing campaigns apart from anything else. And I think that does them no good because they just render themselves looking very, very inauthentic. And we feel somewhat cheated being asked to do these things. I wouldn't say all social movements are good by any means. There have been many, many social, like the Ku Klux Klan was not a good social movement. Nazism, I guess, in its way, in its early days, was not a good social movement. So I guess the way to think about it, there's various. I think we've been talking about various levels here. We've been talking about whole businesses who are taking on some of the principles of social movements as to kind of create their own business model, if you like. So. And maybe the companies in the peer-to-peer marketplace model or the sharing economy are like that, where they've had like a kind of a larger vision of how the world should be and so on. Then there are companies that may have a specific goal, like Unilever in a way with Dove had, I don't think they did it very well, but they, when they had the whole Real Beauty campaign, there was something very interesting starting there where they were trying to do the same thing as their Photoshop idea, which was, why are all models fake, basically? Why are objectifying women and created this impossible standard that women and girls have to reach? And they failed, however, because again, they didn't make a collective ask. They just basically ran a media campaign, in my view. So
But their customer base went up, didn't it?
Yes. No, it's successful, but they could have done so much more.
Yeah.
It's bottled out, actually.
Right.
That was I can't really talk about it, but that was an organisation we worked with Unilever for a little while, but it just wasn't going to work. So so there's this whole business model way of thinking about it and borrowing techniques from that, and then there's particular campaigns that you can use. So, for example, I don't know whether we've borrowed those techniques to build Airbnb's business model, but we certainly very directly borrowed those techniques in the community mobilization stuff that I've been leading in Barcelona and San Francisco and other cities where we've organized the community to take political action to change the law, basically. I don't know. Did I answer the question? I just rambled, didn't I? But I guess what I'm struggling with here is that there's a meta level and then a specific level of borrowing those techniques. And certainly I've seen many production companies use sports-related campaigns and social good campaigns and everything in a real lame, inauthentic way.
Yeah. So the question I was going to ask you, Paula, is about, putting on your hat as an anthropologist. To what degree does this really sort of change the handbook on business leadership, right? I mean, I think that you could look at traditional models of business leadership, and most of them, you would argue, are actually 180 degrees from traditional models of leading social movement.
So I would agree with what Douglas said earlier, that this is not for all businesses, right? Mm-hmm. It's for a slice of consumer-facing businesses where the community is really baked into the product and where those values are highly aligned. And that's, for that slice of business, this is the future, and we're disrupting, disrupting industries from hotels to transportation to, there's a lot of unforeseen implications here that people need to catch up with, right? Mm-hmm. There's also kind of a lighter playbook that I think applies to almost all consumer-facing businesses and probably to some more enterprise-type businesses too, which is like, your relationship with your customer is fundamentally different than it was before. Mm-hmm. And you can't just hire a social media manager, right? You really need to think about the communities that you're part of and how they're mobilized and how you're aligned with them, right? So you see the rise of folks like, there's a piece in HBR about the rise of the chief customer officer. This is something you can talk about too, because in a way, all of this stuff is also made up, right? Like this is also emergent. And Douglas, when we were talking a few months ago, and he was telling me about how the idea of brand building and brand management was something that was fundamentally, created and almost proselytized, and now it's mainstream business practice. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Oh, you mean when we're talking about brand strategy?
Yeah, brand strategy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the whole brand strategy was, or account planning was started in the UK originally, and ad agencies in the UK, and then was bought. This is how I came to America. Came over here, and then gradually was spread around. But actually, I think the really interesting. A friend of mine wrote a book called Brand Hijack. To your point, which is he was well ahead of his time. 10 years ago, he wrote this book. It's a really good book. And basically, he was saying, until recently, many companies have prosecuted consumers who have sort of hijacked their brand. So I think Mattel makes Barbie, I think. Like they were there were phalanxes of lawyers would slap you down with cease and desist if you like fiddled with the Barbie and it's, posted pictures of it online or something. And his point was that's what you should be encouraging, not prosecuting, because when the consumer, I hate to use that word, when people feel such ownership of your product or service that they make their own customized version of it, that's a winner. Actually, so that video we started with, that launched our logo and everything. As I say, most companies have departments of lawyers who prosecute or try and send evil letters to people if you fiddle with their logo. We actually asked our members to fiddle with our logo. We actually created a site called airbnb.com/create, and we asked people to create your own version of our logo. In fact, we designed the logo so that people could do that. Because, we've got this, it looks very pretty like this, but actually it's like this. So you can draw it yourself. And we got over 80,000 people did their own versions of our logo, which they then could print off on T-shirts and cards and everything else. So we did the very opposite of what like 99% of companies do, because we are a community-driven brand, basically.
Yeah.
It's not us. We've got almost 1 million hosts now and about 25 million guests who are... It's their brand. They're creating a sense of belonging anywhere, not us.
Thank you. I have another question for you guys, but again, anyone in the audience, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm kind of on the social movement side of things. My colleague Susan and I are in a small group working with a team from the Social Sector Solutions here at the Haas Business School. And so we work in the nonprofit world. We work with seniors, older adults. And we're part of something called the Village Movement. There's about 150 villages across the country, and we help people stay in the homes and neighborhoods that they love. Well, we're studying with the Social Sector Solutions Group, how do we partner with some strategic business partners to help us on the revenue side of what we're doing. So I'm sitting here thinking, how do we wed our social movement with a business? Do you have any advice for us? I think we're not, we have a different scenario than what I heard described here tonight. Does it make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Gosh. I don't think we can answer it up here.
Pardon me?
But,
Yeah, it sounds like a more extended
It sounds like a more
conversation.
extended conversation than giving a sort of off-the-cuff answer up here. But I don't see why not. That sounds like an amazing idea.
Yeah. So
But you really have to find the right partner, obviously.
right,
And obviously your goals and the partner's goals have to be completely aligned.
right.
Otherwise it's going to end in tears.
And we have to be really clear about the value proposition for both sides, right?
Yes.
So what's in it for them, what's in it for us?
Yes.
But we have the power of this growing movement.
Yes.
And who's the business that could benefit from that? And then how would we benefit from the revenue? And the, whatever that looks like, I don't know.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a rhetorical question, which is, are you sure you're not a business? Right? Because staying,
We know we are.
okay. So
We
because
know.
and that in and of itself, like the idea of people staying in place and the communities around that and stuff, that is fundamentally not only an identity and well-being based model, it's also an economic opportunity, and right. So
We get that. What the difficulty that we're having is scaling to the point where we can sustain ourselves just based on the membership fees that we charge people.
right, and
So-
that's the heart of my question, which is, are you sure you're not a business? Are you sure you shouldn't be offering products and services that enable people.
This is the Omnion Network investor.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
No, I agree with you. And I love what you said about branding. I think that's absolutely a big takeaway for me. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else before I dive back in, please?
Hello, and thank you for spending some time with us this evening. I want to get your opinion on the Invisible Children movement, how that sort of started off. There was a lot of hype, and then there was a lot of fizzle. And do you think that was because maybe you said earlier you need to have very, very high targets, and just setting a target of as removing one person, Joseph Kony, maybe that wasn't a high enough target, whereas it was sort of sustain the movement. What are your opinions on that?
Oh, I don't know enough about that movement, actually. Do you know?
I do. So really, really amazing case study insofar. I mean, many of us will have seen those videos from a couple of years ago about stopping Kony. The level of audience penetration was extremely high, and built up for many years, and built on pre-existing Christian communities, and then went kind of to broader audiences. And then fell off the radar screen. First, they were subject to a lot of criticism here, and then sort of they abandoned that. They kind of tapered down that campaign, but are still very, very active on the ground in that pursuit of justice with Kony and his colleagues. So while I'm not familiar enough around the questions and the strategies and tactics after they received all this public criticism in the United States, what I do know, I guess the one insight that I would share is that movements have to really, really simplify things often to get massive traction. And it's one of the inherent contradictions that movements deal with, which is they have to set, as Douglas was saying, like a really clear, tangible and sort of impossible goal. So like, let's get Kony. And they're not going to, and the reason that video went viral was because it was a very, very clear narrative, as opposed to saying like, actually there's this very complex political economic system and Joseph Kony is one part of it, and people just their eyes glaze over, right? But that's exactly what they were criticized for, and that's exactly what the backlash is. Meanwhile, on the ground, they have gotten a ton of, they've worked directly with a number of partners and have gotten a lot of heavy players in Kony's army out of there and have made a tremendous amount of progress, right? So the public part of it was only one part of the story. And that's about as much as I know.
Interesting. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so just kind of related to that last question, that particular movement, I remember when it came out feeling really conflicted because it seemed like it was raising awareness. But like I was working in Africa at the time, and a lot of me and my friends felt like you were saying that really complex issues were boiled down to something simple just to get people riled up. So I wanted to hear more about your thoughts on kind of like that balance between, on the one hand, keeping people really focused towards achieving a goal, and then on the other hand, making like the social movement kind of open enough that people feel like they're able to participate. Like, how do you balance between focused and then being open?
You take it?
I think the best ones are a bit of both. And that is that when those hosts came up and said, yes, but we don't know how to organize themselves, that there were certain skills that they didn't have. And some of those, in no particular order, some of those skills were things like framing. Framing is a word that's used a lot in movement making. So framing the issue in a way that either mobilizes large numbers of people to get involved, or frames it in such a way that the media, often the same thing, the media picks it up. Those are really hard skills to get, and average citizens generally don't have that ability. So that's one area. Another thing is grassroots organizing, which is the sort of bedrock of any good movement, is really hard, extremely labor intensive, and very expensive. So, just to give you a very small example, in San Francisco, again picking up on that. So we decided there are 11 supervisor districts in San Francisco. We felt that the best thing to do to help Peter was to split his overall group that represented all of San Francisco hosts into 11 districts representing the supervisor districts. And we created these 11 district action teams. Now, they were all led not by us, but by our hosts. But we hired 11 field organizers. Field organizers are these people that you see in political campaign offices. You know, they're the ones that sometimes call you up and say, please come to the rally tomorrow night, blah, 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 blah. So these, I love these people because they, I've never seen people that can scale intimacy, is the way I think about it. They create personal relationships with all 6,000 of our hosts. And it was those personal relationships that got people out, you know, and gave up a day of work to attend a political hearing in the supervisor board or the planning commission or whatever it was. But that takes a huge amount of work. So it takes at least 2 or 3 months to hire the field organizers. In amongst our hosts, it took that amount of time to identify the leaders in each of those 11 districts. Because we had to have basically amateur community leaders. We had to find them, identify them, and train them. And then they in turn needed support. So we had to identify for them social media captains, event captains who could organize the events, membership captains who kept stock of the membership in each of the 11 districts. These are all hosts and often had day jobs, and they were also doing this. So those 11 field organizers built relationships with all those people, helped identify who the leaders were, trained the leaders, then helped the leaders identify their teams, train those, and then organize everyone to... There was a period in July where every single night, just about, our community was meeting 1 or 4 or 5 supervisors on any given night. The supervisors were coming to the homes of the hosts, hearing the stories, or they were going to the supervisors' offices, or they were holding press conferences, or all that. So there's that part of it, which is better if it's centrally organized, and there's resources to make it happen. The other side of it, though, was, the bottom-up part of it was that, well, Peter was the bottom-up leader, and we depended on him to really, 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 really ask loads of questions every day about what people wanted to campaign about, what their issues were, all those kinds of things. And they would often come up with fantastic ideas that through Peter were bubbled up to the organizing group. So there's a long-winded way of saying it's a bit of both, and I was trying to give you some specific examples of how it is a bit of both, if that was helpful. Make sense?
Yeah.
We have time for a couple more questions. Go ahead.
Education-related question. It seems that both social movements and businesses, once they have our attention, and it's organized in a socially responsible business context around action, as in social movements. But what examples or what thoughts do you have about building cultures of learning? Because it seems after we have, we're together and we have a shared cause, there's also a great deal more that we need to learn together, both within our group as well as in relation to outside realities. So I'm just wondering how you see building cultures of learning as crucial to both social movements and responsible business.
Yeah.
Well, I can tangentially answer your question with something I really care about a lot, right? So there's one piece of the social movement learning curve that I think people get so wrong, and it's very hard to figure out how to get right. But if I had one wish for how social movement organizers and community-driven businesses learn, but particularly social movement organizers, is how to educate people about the path towards progress, right? I mean, I've seen time and time and time again, people get riled up. People have very short attention spans, are super busy. They're asked to take one specific action. They take that action. They may or may not see results from that action. And then they tune back in, and 2 years from now, they're being asked to take another action. They have no idea, but I thought I took an action on this thing. Wait, what, this movement is, what, And we have very poor ways of explaining to people, how these things build on each other, and why, winning one campaign in San Francisco doesn't win the war in the United States, but you need to keep going, right? And that's, I think, one place where there's a real deficit, and I think we could really work on doing better.
Right. So, in many campaigns, actually, especially now that there's digital tools that we can use, there are ways of increasing learning. So, for example, on that, I'm sure you've seen it a million times, but on the petition, you have, speaking to what you were just talking about, one important ingredient of movement making is there must be a very good feedback loop. So if you're asking someone to take an action, you owe it to them to tell them whether that action was successful or not, or what you still need to do to make it successful. So that's why, petitions have this sort of little thermometer gauge here. It was originally down here, and then we just kept extending it as we got more and more people. And there's a thing, if we had more time, I'd love to talk about it. It's called the theory of change in movement making. And the theory of change basically is setting your strategy where you need to figure out what the change is you're asking for. So in San Francisco or New York, it was to change the law so it was fairer. And the second is who are the people or the person who can make that change? Is it the mayor? Is it the legislative body? Is it the attorney general? And then it's what you're asking them to do to make that change, like changing the law. And then who are you mobilizing? In our case, is it hosts? Is it guests? Is it small businesses? Is it the whole city? And what are you asking them to do to make that change happen? So there's this whole theory of change. It's basically a big strategy session you have before you start off on the movement making. And you keep going back to that strategy in terms of education, saying, we've got this far, but we still need to go here. Or this did this, but we failed here. So now we're going to do this. You know what I mean? Or we got this setback. And so now we have to change our tactic and do this. Then at a more grassroots level, like in all those 11 district action teams in the supervisor districts, the field organizers basically gave everyone lessons on how to organize themselves and what works. And everyone had wonderful stories to tell about, hosting or being a guest or everything like that. But, sometimes the best way to frame it that will really pique the interest of a legislator rather versus, say, a press person. So in that grassroots level, we got very specific, very local sort of education and training happening. And then at the meta level, there's the whole, this is what we're going for, this is where we are now, we're not there yet, but now we need to do this to get there. Does that answer your question a bit? There's a lot more we can talk about that, as you can imagine.
Douglas, on behalf of everybody here who teaches theory of change, I want to personally thank you for actually validating the fact that...
Oh, God, now I'm embarrassed.
No, you validated the fact that it actually matters.
Oh, God, yeah, it's really important.
World.
You can't start without it. Yeah.
The energy and excitement that you can foster in a community seems to provide great value to business, but those kinds of things can also turn into like insularity and myopia that can sort of diverge from what is ultimately better for business, like being able to grow a more diverse customer base. So how can you, what kind of strategies are there to sort of mitigate that risk and sort of control that energy so that you can guarantee that the interests of the community continue to align with the interests of the business enterprise?
So I can't speak for other businesses, but certainly at Airbnb, our view is create the passion and don't worry about the mainstream. Because if you can create passionate members and users of your business, then they will recruit other like-minded people. And the point is, we're very unlikely to ever get 100% share. So you might as well get a smaller, much more passionate share, which will ultimately, there's lots of use cases for this, like Harley is a really good example, is much more profitable than attempting a larger share with weaker commitment. So certainly at Airbnb, we're just focusing on the commitment. We're not really interested in being everything to all people to get all people, by any means. Don't want to do that at all, in fact. And in fact, we're using Belong Anywhere as our guideline for that. So we will, we'll never be like hotels. We'll never be like other, lodging companies Because what we're trying to do is create a sense of feeling like you can belong anywhere. And so by that definition, it'll be a narrower cast, focus. So we never want to be Ritz-Carlton. We never want to be Hilton. We really never want to be them, ever, at all. Nothing like them. So we won't appeal to everyone. Then in terms of, what was the thing? There was sort of two questions. What was the last thing?
Grow.
Okay, that's a really good question. It's something we've debated a lot. As it happens, I think in peer-to-peer marketplace companies like Airbnb and Lyft and others, because we're marketplaces, there's a massive overlap in our goals. So it's totally in our interest to make sure our hosts are very successful. It's totally in our interest, the company's interest, in making sure that guests feel like they can belong anywhere. There's nothing in between, really. That's why it's probably going back to a much earlier question I think you asked, which is, the culture of the place. That's why it hasn't been hard to run these kinds of campaigns and initiatives at Airbnb anyway, because the needs of our members are the same as our needs, basically. I think that's probably different from a production consumption economy company, where my need to shift 10,000 cars by this quarter may not align with ordinary people's needs. But
I would underline it. So I want to build on that. So one is to say, what Douglas is picking up on is that there's massive economic opportunity just in serving niches, right? And in fact, when you're talking about Western economies where growth has slowed for a long time, arguably that's where the growth is, and are these kinds of companies, right, that are serving particular niches of the industry, but that are massive market opportunities. I can't remember what's the latest valuation of Airbnb? Like unbelievable, right? So that's one. But then I also think that there is a way to thread the needle between the kind of core community, the core folks that identify with a business, and a broader set of customers. Like the classic company. We're at a business school. We haven't mentioned Apple. It has to come up at least once in every panel. So let's bring it up. So think about that, and think about that sort of the core folks that like the designers and the sort of folks that were very key to adoption of Apple and using Apple products seem like the coolest thing to do. And then their ability to thread that needle with that sort of core folks, the people you want to identify with, and then this much broader customer base that's still sort of in a way like, when I pick up an Apple product, I'm like, yeah, this is a great design machine, even though like my job has very little to do with design, right? So I think there is a way to thread the needle.
All right, I'm going to ask the last brief question of the night. So in the audience, and then for people watching and people who will watch, there are many entrepreneurs who I think would probably really love the idea of trying to emulate Airbnb, to disrupt and create community. If you could tell this entrepreneur to focus on one thing as their anchor on that journey, what would it be?
Oh, bugger me.
And maybe it's a principle, to make sure that they never
find the
let go.
passion, basically. I think that what I would do is always identify what the need is. There have been so many startups and products launched where no one's really understood the fundamental need. Are you meeting a real need? And if you are, and it's not being met by anyone else, then there's a good chance you're going to succeed. As it happened, I think at Airbnb we uncovered, there was many needs, but we've actually helped people understand a need that they didn't know they had, but actually really glad they discovered. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, yes. I can't tell you the number of people who say, "Oh God, thank God I don't have to stay in a hotel again." Uh-huh. It's so soulless, soul-sucking, eroding, all those kinds of things. Whatever. Many hotels are great, and I actually like staying in many hotels. But that being said, and I don't know, yes, identify what the real need is and pursue the passion.
Okay.
But by that, what I mean is, when you're talking to people about what the need is, I don't know what it is, what your idea is, but find out what energizes them and what really pisses them off and what really, really makes them excited. Follow that, basically. Because generally, I think as a general rule, that's what people are going to really respond to when you've got a good offering. It's founded in someone's passionate need or passionate desire. Good.
Thank you. Paula?
I would say two things. One, be a little edgy. So, and that's, I think, core to, going back to the identity point about social movements, like, folks want to feel that they're part of something that's different, right? So you've seen all these kind of brilliant campaigns by companies like, harnessing that, like the North Face. So this is in the article when North Face went into China. They did this whole like Get Wild campaign where they pictured sort of old Chinese artists from paintings in North Face gear and started creating all these outdoors clubs and thereby position the whole idea. This is a new thing in the culture of outdoors being part of your hobby and activity and stuff like that. And they did that and sort of positioned it as a sort of counterculture, and were wildly successful in market entry because of that. So that's one. And then the second is more tactical, which is like, don't create walls between your community and your product. That's about human resources, right? That's making sure that your community is helping determine and create your product. And I think a lot of companies get that wrong.
Thank you. So let's give Douglas and Paula a big hand.
Thank you.